All right, this is the video for Module 8. And in Module 8, let's see, you're going to read Spring Chapter 8. And there's a very short PowerPoint that goes along with that. That PowerPoint, I usually do an activity in my face-to-face class with that PowerPoint, so it's very condensed and it just kind of sums up because we can't obviously do that activity online. But there is a very condensed, summary there. But it certainly is very brief. It's 4 or 5 slides. So definitely read the chapter, because it is important to understand that at this time in history, what Spring starts talking about is the welfare function of schools. And of course, due to the large amounts of immigrants coming into the United States at the time, the global migration that's going on between the 1880s and 1930s or so, it affects certainly the United States in lots of different ways. Obviously, the way that education, if it's compulsory, it becomes compulsory. How do you address that? How do you address just such a large increase in enrollment and in population in the American schools? So he addresses that in this chapter, and he talks about the differences. Now the United States is getting Eastern and Southern European immigrants, and the differences there are not only in language and culture, but also religion. Many more Catholics and Jews and, Russian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, people of those denominations are coming into the country. So, Americanization is an issue. Culturalization is an issue. So many Americanization programs start to become, standard within the schooling, system. And of course, again, because the United States is a relatively new country, the United States doesn't have all the bureaucratic structures that a lot of the European countries have in place to, address a lot of the concerns and the social services that are needed in addition to education. So, since education becomes one of the first, really sort of embedded infrastructures in our society, the bureaucratic infrastructure, that is the place that ends up sort of addressing a lot of the other needs, a lot of the other welfare needs of the citizens. So, he goes into detail about how those things take place. And we're talking health and nutrition, and not just education. Ways to address poverty during this time as well, with, the different populations going to the American schools. So he talks about the kindergarten movement, the play movement, home economics comes up. Our food style is changing within the United States, and there's a couple of different things going on here. Americanizing students, new arrived immigrants to the country can take place in lots of different ways, and not just in education. It can take place through the American menu, and it can also, free up mothers to be more involved in their community if they're not slaving over a stove all day long, or when they're not working, and so forth. So processed foods, canned foods become very popular and are very encouraged during this time, which is kind of the opposite of what we're doing now. But it's a time-saving factor, and it makes the mothers more available to their children, kind of a thing, and the mothers more available to be in the community and to be there for their families. So that's just one of the many things that they would teach in home economics. So there's just lots of different things that take place in this chapter that are pretty interesting, and that will correlate a little bit with the reading, the Putnam reading that I'm having you do this module as well. So then in the Ravitch readings, in the first 20 chapters, she lays out sort of the issues that are happening within the educational system and the public schools of the United States right now, in her eyes, and what the different factors are, and how they've come about. And that's why I kind of have always liked her, is that she's an educational historian. So she definitely has the perspective of, many decades and centuries of schooling that have happened in this country, that she can compare it to. But anyway, so starting in chapter 21, and your readings this time around are 21 to 24. Anyway, starting in chapters 21 through 24, she starts talking about solutions, solutions, which is great. We've been waiting for this, right? Okay, here's all the problems, now here's the solutions. So I think the thing to keep in mind is that some of these solutions are very doable. I think that if we get the right people in office, in a political office, hopefully we can change some of the things that are happening now, and we can be less focused on standardized testing, and we can have a more balanced curriculum and all of these things. But some of the other issues are a lot more difficult. We know what the solution is. We always have. If you want to lose weight, you have to exercise and eat less, or eat fewer calories, right? We know what the solution is to losing weight, but do we have the will to do it? It's the same thing in education. Do we have the political, civic, whatever, social will to actually do these things? So anyway, but we begin, and so she goes through solutions number 1 through 3, and prenatal care, high quality early childhood education, which is always shown to benefit later on in the school years, and a full, balanced, and diverse curriculum are the first 3 things that she talks about with solutions. So then the last reading that you're going to do this time around is the Putnam reading. And he is an interesting, person, sociologist. He by no means came up with the term social capital, but he's going to be talking a lot about social capital. What I've given you is the introduction to the whole book, and then I've given you the introduction to like the section 3, I think it is, or whatever, in his book. It's a very lengthy book, and I've just given you a few excerpts of it because it's really interesting stuff. And this is what I'm, going back to talking about Laroe, and we'll talk more about social science research later on in the semester. But, obviously education is a very important topic with regard to social science research. And just some of the ways that social science research has, helped, inhibited, been a part of education, these are just, a little tip of the iceberg that I'm showing you here. But I've always found Putnam stuff to be kind of interesting. It's been something that was relevant to my work for my dissertation, and just things that I'm interested in. I mean, I'm a assistant scoutmaster for the Boy Scouts of America for my 2 boys in their troop, and I take, civic, as a former social studies teacher for 14 years, I take civic engagement pretty seriously. And so what Putnam is basically talking about is that civic engagement, and basically ways to network social capital in the United States, goes in sort of waves. That at times it's more important and it's better developed in our country, and then at times it's not as well developed. And we are in one of those times. It has declined a great deal, and that's why the book is called Bowling Alone. There's not the bowling leagues that our grandparents or parents, who whatever age you might be, great grandparents, I suppose, when they used to go to the bowling league and engage in the Lions or the Rotary or the Kiwanis, those types of clubs as civic or service organizations. Anyway, so he talks about this, and what he basically comes down to is that social capital impacts our lives tremendously if you have it, and if you don't, obviously it can hurt you at times. Now there's obviously differences in both directions. Sometimes social capital can be used for bad, as he explains in part of the introduction. So it's not always a good thing. And then, sometimes communities that don't have external social capital but have a very tight-knit community in other ways can be successful. But anyway, generally speaking, social capital is positively correlated with good things for children, and that's in the second part of the reading that I'm going to have you do. So how is education impacted by social capital? This is similar to what Lareau was talking about. Now, she was talking about cultural capital, which is a little bit different than what he is talking about, but he's talking about the positive correlation between communities that have social capital and education. Education with regard to child development, to school performance, and things like even less TV. And of course, he controls for a bunch of other factors, including poverty, race, community makeup, all these other factors that he discusses. So I'm just interested in what your ideas about this are and what your reaction to it is. I think it's an interesting sort of a premise. I think some parts of that are not addressed, since this was published in the year 2000, is he does have a section on the internet, but I'm not sure it was completely understood the ways that we are now networking via electronic means versus going to bowling leagues or bowling alleys, on Thursday nights, kind of a thing. So I think that aspect definitely is going to need a lot more research. And I know there's research being done on it right now. I read an article, I don't know, about a year ago that definitely sort of contradicted what Putnam's thesis is. And the new author basically said that adults are interacting in other ways, and not just Facebook and Twitter and these types of things, but they are actually getting involved in civic means online and becoming engaged in other ways. Look at the Arab Spring, or the ways that social media have helped develop civic engagement as well. So I think it is definitely something interesting for you to read. So it's only about 30 pages total. It may look like a lot, but it's really not. So go ahead and do that reading, and your discussion prompt, I believe, will be on the Putnam excerpt. So the only other thing you will have left to do for this module then is to take the number 4 quiz, and it'll be 10 questions as usual. And I think that's it for module 8. So I will see you in module 9.